Why does a Russian tank look like it has been sat on? That is not an accident. The T-72 sits so low to the ground that a human loader cannot fit inside the turret the way a Western loader can. So the Soviets removed him. They replaced him with a carousel of shells and a mechanical arm that grabs around and drives it into the breach without a person touching it. Meanwhile, the American M1 Abrams is taller, heavier, and still carries a fourth crewman whose only job is to load the gun by hand. Most people look at that comparison and assume the Americans are behind. That assumption is wrong. The real explanation goes much deeper than automation, and it starts with which crew death each army was most afraid of. Look at the silhouette of a T-72 next to an M1 Abrams, and the difference hits you immediately. The Soviet tank is almost flat. The turret barely rises above the hull. There is no loader's hatch where Western designers always put one. The whole vehicle sits roughly 2.5 meters tall. The Abrams stands nearly 3 meters. That height difference does not come from American over-engineering or Soviet cleverness. It comes from two completely different answers to the same question. What happens when a shell penetrates your armor and reaches your ammunition? The Soviet answer, built into every T-64, T-72, T-80, and T-90 produced across 50 years, is to reduce the crew so fewer people are at risk, and to keep the vehicle low so fewer hits happen in the first place. The American answer, built into the Abrams from its earliest prototype, is to separate the ammunition from the crew with armored blast doors and vent any explosion away from the people inside. Both answers are logical. Both answers have a cost, and the cost of each one only became fully visible when these tanks went to war. The Soviet pressure to build an autoloader was not about technology for its own sake. It came from scale. After the Second World War, Soviet military doctrine called for armored formations measured in thousands of vehicles. Building 10,000 tanks is one problem, manning them is another. Each tank with a human loader needs 4 trained crewmen. Remove the loader, and you need 3. Across 10,000 vehicles, that difference is 10,000 fewer soldiers to recruit, train, feed, pay, and replace when killed. At the scale the Soviet military operated, crew reduction was not a convenience. It was a logistics calculation with direct consequences for how large an army could actually be sustained in the field. There was a second problem layered underneath the first. Soviet designers, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, were driving toward a lower and lower tank profile with every new generation. A lower profile means a smaller target. A smaller target is harder to hit. But fitting a human loader into a very low turret created real ergonomic problems. The space available for a loader to stand, rotate, grab a heavy round from the ready rack, and ram it into the breech efficiently was shrinking with each design iteration. The autoloader did not just replace a person. It made the low-profile turret physically possible without turning the loader's job into an exercise in contortion under fire while someone was trying to kill him. The T-64 introduced the solution in the mid-1960s. A carousel of rounds sits beneath the turret floor, arranged in a circle. A mechanical arm selects a shell, lifts it, and rams it into the breech. The loading cycle runs at roughly 6 to 8 seconds per round under good conditions. 3 crewmen, commander, gunner, driver, operate the tank. The turret stays low, the silhouette stays small. The crew shrinks by 1. On paper, it is a clean solution to multiple problems stacked on top of each other. The American military was watching all of this. The MBT-70, a joint development program between the United States and West Germany running through the late 1960s, included an auto-loading system as part of its design. American engineers studied it seriously and tested it with real intent. The U.S. Army did not reject the autoloader out of stubbornness or institutional laziness. They rejected it because of what the autoloader required the ammunition to do and where it required the ammunition to sit. An autoloader needs its rounds close and accessible at all times. In Soviet designs, the shells live in a carousel in the lower turret and hull, directly surrounding the crew compartment. When a penetrating hit reaches that ammunition, and modern anti-tank weapons are specifically designed to reach exactly that, the propellant charges and projectiles cook off together. The pressure has nowhere to go except through the turret ring. The turret does not crack or warp. It separates from the hull and becomes a projectile. In the 1991 Gulf War, Iraqi T-72 turrets were found 30 meters from their hulls. In Ukraine after 2022, the same image repeated so consistently that it became one of the defining visuals of the entire conflict. Analysts counted them in footage. Crews inside those vehicles did not survive. The U.S. Army carried specific concerns about this exact failure mode before the Abrams ever went into full production. The solution they chose was the turret bustle. The ammunition in an M1 Abrams is stored at the rear of the turret in a compartment physically separated from the crew by armored blast doors. If a penetrating hit reaches that ammunition and it ignites, panels in the roof of the bustle blow outward. The explosion vents up and away from the crew compartment. The tank may be destroyed. The crew has a real and documented chance of walking away from it. That system requires a loader. The loader's job is to open the blast door, retrieve a round from the bustle, close the blast door, and present the round to the breech. That sequence cannot be performed by a carousel beneath the floor. It requires a person positioned at the bustle, able to move, able to reach, able to manage the door under stress. The turret has to be tall enough to make that physically possible. The Abrams is tall because the blowout panel system demands the height. The fourth crewman is not a failure to modernize. The fourth crewman is what makes the survivability architecture actually function. Here is where both systems ran into the problems they were each designed to avoid. The autoloader in Soviet and Russian tanks has mechanical failure modes that a human loader does not. It can jam under battle damage. It requires specific maintenance conditions. Early carousel designs carried a documented reputation for malfunctions when the vehicle was not kept in good order, but the structural problem was always the ammunition placement. The carousel sits where it has to sit to feed the gun, in the lower hull and turret ring area, surrounding the crew, directly in the path of the threats most likely to penetrate the vehicle. There is no architectural fix for that within the Soviet low-profile design philosophy. The ammunition has to be somewhere. In Soviet and Russian tanks, it is somewhere that shares space with everyone still alive inside. The Abrams carries its own set of costs that the autoloader was designed to avoid. It is heavy. The M1A2 variant sits above 68 tons fully loaded. That weight creates serious strategic deployment problems. Moving Abrams tanks to a theater of operations requires careful planning around airlift capacity, sea transport, bridge weight limits, and road conditions. The tank is large enough that certain terrain and infrastructure simply cannot support it without engineering work. And the loader is a human being who gets tired, gets wounded, and gets killed. In sustained combat over hours, human loading speed drops. A loader who goes down reduces the crew to 3 and forces the remaining crew to adapt under fire. A 3-man crew in a Soviet or Russian tank carries a different kind of strain. With no fourth person, the commander and gunner absorb observation, communication, and situational awareness tasks that a 4-man Western crew distributes more evenly. In long operations, that cognitive load builds. The tank may cycle rounds at a consistent mechanical rate, but the people directing it are operating with 1 fewer pair of eyes and 1 fewer person handling the information flow of a modern armored fight. That is a cost that does not show up in loading speed comparisons, but accumulates across hours and days of continuous operations. The Gulf War of 1991 dropped a large and ugly data set on military analysts trying to settle this debate. Iraqi T-72s suffered repeated catastrophic cook-offs from penetrating hits. American Abrams tanks that were struck, including several by friendly fire in fratricide incidents, showed a different pattern. Crews survived in vehicles where the blowout panels functioned as designed. The comparison looked like a decisive verdict, but it carried serious contamination. Iraqi crews were not operating at Soviet training standards. Maintenance on Iraqi T-72s was inconsistent. Ammunition quality was variable. The tactical situations were not controlled. Drawing clean conclusions about autoloaders versus blowout panels from Gulf War performance required a level of careful analysis that most popular accounts skipped entirely. Ukraine, after 2022, reopened the question with a comparison that was harder to dismiss. Russian T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s, operated by Russian crews with better training and maintenance baselines than 1991 Iraqi forces, showed the same catastrophic turret separation pattern at rates that became statistically significant. Modern anti-tank guided missiles and top attack munitions reached the carousel repeatedly. The turrets flew. Analysts tracked it in open-source footage across hundreds of vehicles. The pattern was not a product of poor Iraqi maintenance. It was the autoloaders' structural vulnerability playing out against the anti-armor technology that exists now, which is categorically better at reaching exactly the space where the carousel sits than the threats Soviet designers were accounting for in the 1960s. There is one more layer that rarely gets discussed in the online arguments about this. The autoloader was designed around a specific threat environment, a large-scale conventional war in Central Europe against NATO forces, fought at range, where the low profile of Soviet tanks mattered enormously, and where the sheer number of vehicles in the formations made individual crew survival secondary to mass tactical performance. In that environment, the logic of the autoloader holds reasonably well. Three-man crews, thousands of vehicles, low silhouettes, consistent mechanical loading. The system was coherent for the war it was designed to fight. The Abrams was designed around a different assumption: smaller formations, better trained crews, higher per-vehicle investment, and a doctrine that put significant weight on keeping experienced crews alive and returning them to the fight. In that environment, the blowout panel system and the fourth crewman reflect a bet that crew survival and crew quality matter more than crew reduction. That bet also held reasonably well in the environments the Abrams actually fought in. Neither army designed a tank for the war in Ukraine, and Ukraine exposed the degree to which the autoloader's structural vulnerability, the carousel sitting where it sits, surrounded by the crew, with no architectural solution available within the low-profile design, is not a problem that better training or better maintenance fully addresses. It is a problem that exists in the geometry of the vehicle. Go back to that low, flat Soviet turret. The missing loader's hatch is visible in every photograph, every piece of footage, every scaled model ever built from the design. That gap in the turret roof is the physical mark of a specific decision made under specific pressures. Reduce the crew, lower the profile, accept that the ammunition will sit close to whoever is still alive inside. The Abrams height is the mark of the opposite decision. Keep the ammunition separated, protect the crew from their own rounds, accept the weight and the size and the fourth man that separation demands. Neither army was wrong about the threat it was building around. The Soviets were right that a smaller target gets hit less often, and right that at their scale of operations, crew reduction had compounding value across entire armies. The Americans were right that when a tank does get hit, the difference between 3 dead crewmen and 3 surviving ones is very often where the ammunition was stored at the moment of impact. The choice between those two answers was never really about which army was more advanced. It was about which death the designers were most afraid of. And both armies answered that question clearly, and left the answer visible in the shape of the vehicle. If this kind of military design breakdown is what you come here for, subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from. And if you want to keep going right now, the next video is right there.